everyone who has joined so far. I know other people will still join, but it is going to be recorded, so you can always they can watch whatever they miss. So my name is Michael Cowan. So I'm a member of the state board for the Georgia Native Plant Society. I'm also chairman of the statewide advocacy committee and a member of the education committee for the North Metro chapter. And that is who is bringing you this presentation tonight. So this is the second iteration of our seasonal exploration of native plants in the Piedmont series, this time with a heavy focus on the biology of leaf change in the fall. Our presenter is again Dr. John Storm, who's a biology professor at the University of South Carolina upstate, and also the proprietor or the owner of the Southern Piedmont Natural History Facebook page. And they do daily posts, or he does daily posts of educational and sometimes funny stuff that is very interesting. So that's how we knew of his existence and how we thought, well, this would be great to do something like that in a longer sense. And so that's how this presentation and webinar came about. So again, I encourage you, if you are not already a member of, or you don't see those posts every day, go in there and like it. It's Southern Piedmont Natural History. It's on Facebook, and you'll see that every day. So also, I just want to say, if you aren't a member yet of the Native Plant Society, you can always go to gnps.org and click on the membership tab and become a member. It's very simple and easy to do. And then also, whether you're a member or not, I have a task for you. Georgia state flower right now is actually an invasive plant from China. So we are spearheading an effort to make our state flower a native plant, one that is from Georgia that we can be proud of. So there's also on the gnps.org instructions and Q&A and all the information you'll need of how we intend to change the state flower from the invasive Cherokee rose to the native Sweet Bay magnolia. So a little bit of housekeeping. So for Q&A during the presentation, you'll see that at the bottom of your screen. So if you do have a question, put it in the Q&A, and then we'll make sure we get to it at the end. And if you see another question that you'd like, or that you also thought of, you can actually kind of upvote it, like that question, and then we'll make sure we get to that first, although I don't think we'll have a problem getting to all the questions. So with that, again, it is being recorded. It'll be posted on the same gnps.org website later. And with that, I want to turn it over to Dr. Storm.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Michael. Is my sound coming across okay?
Yep.
Awesome. Well, welcome everybody. So we're going to continue our theme from last time, but continue with things that happen more in the fall and late summer as we're kind of transitioning here into the colder time of the year. If you have questions that come up, like Michael said, put them in the comments and I can address those at the end. If a topic of interest comes up that maybe you would want to see in a future talk, maybe one for the winter or one for the spring, put it in the comments and I can see if I can fit that in there for the upcoming talks. Probably can. So just let me know what's of interest to you and I'll try to address that. So we're going to go into things that you would probably find around in nature right now, things you might see on your drive to work, things you might see out on a hike in the woods. So as we do that, I'll talk about different ways that you can try to help wildlife and plants in your natural communities, things that can provide nectar sources for pollinators like bees and wasps, things you can do to help birds with providing native plants that give us fruits to help those birds make that fall migration or that spring migration that we'll have happening here later on or early next year, and other aspects as well throughout the talk. But one of the things you're probably noticing right now when you're driving by a field or maybe looking at a roadside ditch is you're seeing lots of these yellow flowers out there in the field. And there's a lot of different things that could be. But what a lot of people erroneously think about it is they think that this is something that they need to cut down because it's going to cause their hay fever or their allergies to go crazy. And that's not the case. What you're seeing for many of those yellow flowers out in the field or roadside right now is goldenrod, of which there are many native species. They're pretty challenging to tell some of them apart. Solidago is the genus for them. And they're a great native plant to support pollinators, a real powerhouse for pollinators here in the eastern United States. If you look at goldenrod in the Atlanta area, for instance, Solidago plants in Atlanta and the surrounding area support at least 92 species of moths and butterflies. So providing food source for the caterpillars or food source for nectar and pollen for butterflies and moths. That's just moths and butterflies, not any of the wasps and bees and flies and many of the other things that goldenrod can do. So you might see things like this caterpillar right here, a really pretty one called the brown-hooded owlet that turns into a brown moth as it matures into the moth. You can also find on goldenrods consuming that vegetation the wavy-lined emerald, which is a pretty interesting caterpillar. I've got an example of one right here. This is not one I found on Solidago, the goldenrods. Rather, I found this one on a blackberry bush. And so I've got a picture of it here on some blackberries, but what you actually see as the caterpillar is mostly not caterpillar. Sometimes this caterpillar is called the camouflaged looper, and for a good reason, because it's pretty well camouflaged with parts of plants that it feeds on. Like this one right here, I think I can get the, let's see, can I get the mouse here? I think I know how to get that. Is that showing it? No, that's not it. How do I do that here? Here we go. No. Used Zoom for this in a while. Where's my, I thought I had a laser pointer on here. Let's see. Spotlight, let's see what that does. There we go. So, oh, that took it away. I'll go back and get it here. There's my spotlight there. Okay.
We can see your
okay, you see it now? All right. So
yeah.
The caterpillar, most of it is this material right in here, which is actually parts of the flowers of the blackberry that the caterpillar was feeding on. So one of the interesting things about this caterpillar is that as it feeds on plants, it takes bits and parts of those plants, puts them onto its back as a way to camouflage itself. Hence, one of the names for the caterpillar is the camouflaged looper. And so they blend in really well with the plant that they're feeding on due to those parts that they add to their body. Another insect you might find on them is the common buckeye. This is a very common and beautiful butterfly that you can find on goldenrods this time of year. I've seen many of them out there in fields right now. They feed and nectar at those goldenrod plants. And you can find things other than moths and butterflies as well, like spiders. Green lynx spiders are very common to find on goldenrod, sitting there waiting for prey to come up to those flowers, be it a fly or a bee, and then pounce on them and have a nice little snack of a insect feeding on the nectar from one of those goldenrod flowers. So as an example of that, here is some video of goldenrods right now. And you can find lots of sites like this out there with wasps and bees and flies all over those goldenrod, going after pollen, going after nectar this time of year. So this one right here is one of the wasps called the least paper wasp. It feeds on those goldenrod plants, going for nectar and pollen, but other native plants as well. So going after mountain mints and bone sets, many different native plants that it'll feed on. And if you look up close at it, right here on the body, you can see little yellow dots on it. And those are some of the pollen grains from the goldenrod, probably, on that wasp. So as it's going after the nectar, it bumps into the anthers on the flowers. The anthers are the part that stick up and have the pollen grains. And then those get on the body of that wasp. It flies off to another goldenrod plant and transfers potentially some of that pollen from one goldenrod plant to another plant for cross-pollination and the formation of goldenrod seeds that'll give us the next generation of goldenrod. So they do that simply by going after nectar in the plant, going after pollen in the plant, and bumping into those pollen-bearing anthers on the goldenrod. It's also going after caterpillars on goldenrod. So they will capture caterpillars and bring those back to their nest, feed them to their larvae to let them grow up and turn into that next generation of least paper wasps. And several of our native wasps live that sort of a life cycle going after caterpillars. Another thing you'll find out there quite a bit right now is lots of bees. Here is one I just took a picture of a few days ago. You can see the long tongue of that bee right here. I'm going in there to get some nectar on that goldenrod. You've got the pollen-bearing anthers right there where it can get some of that pollen onto its body. Once again, you see the little yellow dots there on the head and on the legs where that's getting transferred to that bee to then carry it off to another goldenrod plant and cross-pollinate the pollen of one plant onto the female flower parts of another goldenrod plant. So they're doing this to get food to survive right now, but also with many of our bees gathering pollen to take back and put into their nest and overwinter with that stored food source. So they're gathering that for the overwintering period as well right now. Something else you'll find on goldenrod are these ailanthus webworm moths, or what's also called an ermine moth. So really small little moth. You can find many of them on some of the plants. Very beautiful coloration with that orange and yellow and black coloration to them. It's not a moth we've had around a long time here. They historically are more down into more subtropical regions, further south of us into Florida and down into tropical parts of the Americas. But they've moved further north as we've had the introduction of Tree of Heaven. So you've probably got some familiarity, some of you, with Tree of Heaven. It's one of our more invasive plants from Asia, very common in roadsides, railroad rights of ways, things like that. Ailanthus webworm moths feed on the leaves of that Tree of Heaven as a caterpillar, and that's led to their range expansion north as Tree of Heaven was introduced into this part of the country. But the moth itself is technically native to the United States, just not quite as far north historically as we can find it now, but a very common moth to find. Another plant you're finding out there probably a lot right now in roadsides and fields is a variety of bone sets. This one right here, the common bone set. This genus, Eupatorium, hosts 34 species of moths and butterflies in the Atlanta area. So we're another great pollinator plant, providing lots of flowers with nectar, but also lots of food sources for caterpillars of moths and butterflies. Things like the red-humped caterpillar that you can see right here with that characteristic red hump right there. Typically, I find these in some decent-sized aggregations of maybe 10 individuals or 20 individuals sometimes. The caterpillar of the Clymene moth also feeds on bone sets. So this moth, it's kind of a hard one to find. They blend in with the leaf litter pretty well. You can see that from that nice little light tan color there and the darker brown. But it is one of our native moths feeding as a caterpillar on bone sets. So a great pollinator and caterpillar food source for that group of moths. Is this top part of the screen blocked by the menu, or are you guys not seeing that?
I think we're seeing it.
You are seeing it? Okay. Not sure if I can get that out of the way or not.
No, it's fine.
Okay. All right, I won't worry about it. So this is the goldenrod soldier beetle. A lot of these are pretty common on goldenrod, obviously, as you can tell from the name, but also on bone sets, like I've got it pictured here. Uh, they're a beetle that's a pretty nice one to have around in your garden. They do feed on aphids and things like that that you don't probably want around in your garden. But they'll go after pollen in the goldenrod's pollen and bone sets and many other native plants as a food source, and also keeping your garden free of pests that you probably don't want. So one of those beneficial insects that you want to keep around in the garden, the goldenrod soldier beetle with that orange and black coloration right there. So if you're curious about what plants you may have in your yard, what plants you're thinking about adding to your yard, and what that can do for pollinators, how many species you might support, this website right here from the National Wildlife Federation and University of Delaware, nativeplantfinder.nwf.org is where you can go, set up an account, put in your zip code, put in a plant type of interest, and it'll give you the number of caterpillars and various moths and butterflies that are known to use that native plant as a host. So you can figure out what plants you may want to add to attract a certain insect, or maybe one that you've already got, what sort of insects it's supporting, and then go look for those caterpillars or those moths around in your yard at some point in the future. So a great website that you can use to get that information for free. So we mentioned that goldenrod isn't the source of your allergies, but what is the source of that hay fever and allergies that people have with the runny nose and the scratchy throat and all of that stuff? And what's causing that isn't the goldenrod, it's this plant right here. It's the common ragweed, or maybe the giant ragweed is a different species that can do it. But for a lot of people, it's the common ragweed that does it. It has this very dissected leaf shape there with lots of undulations, and then at the tips of every stalk, these upside down clusters of mostly male flowers with some little female flowers that are kind of inconspicuous down there right where that branch comes off the main stalk. So if I blow that female flower way up, you can see one of them right here, and coming off of it are those little white threads that are the stigmas of the female flower. That's the little filamentous part that receives pollen from the male flowers. So that female flower doesn't have any of the pollen-bearing anthers. It only has those little stigma threads that are sticky and catch pollen blowing in the breeze. Higher up and much more abundant are all of the male flowers. So all of these flowers along here are male flowers, dozens of them, each of them maybe a couple of millimeters in diameter. And then within each of those, maybe 10, 15, 20 or more different individual male flowers that produce the pollen that blows off into the breeze and causes your hay fever and all of the allergy issues. So this is the source of that problem in late summer, early autumn for many people. It's particularly the male flowers of the common ragweed. So each of those tiny male flowers, only 2 millimeters in size, yet it can produce 500,000 pollen grains per cluster of male flowers. And they've got, of course, dozens and dozens of those male flowers, giving them the potential to produce possibly many, many hundreds of thousands of pollen grains. But it's not the goldenrod that you have to worry about. Part of the reason for that is that with goldenrod, their pollen is much heavier. It's not a whole lot larger, but it's much heavier, so it doesn't float in the air. It doesn't become airborne nearly as easily as the ragweed pollen does. And it's also very sticky, so it sticks on to pollinators, doesn't get blown off into the breeze very well, although some of it does get up into the air. For the common ragweed, the pollens about the same size, but it's much lighter. It becomes airborne very easily, doesn't have that stickiness. And when you have that condition with many pollen grains being produced, like 500,000 to maybe 1,000,000 pollen grains per plant, you're getting a lot of pollen being put out into the air by every plant. And you've probably got dozens and dozens of those ragweeds around in your area in roadsides, very airborne. And that's the source of your allergy issues, is that ragweed pollen. Now, you may be thinking here, I mean, why do they produce so much pollen? I mean, it just seems like it's an overabundance here, overkill for how much pollen you're producing as a ragweed. It may even make you want to scream or something. Yeah, if you're somebody that suffers from hay fever and those sorts of challenges, so you're sort of left here wondering, like, why does ragweed produce so much pollen? And the answer is how they get their pollen to those female flowers. Unlike the goldenrods, ragweed is wind pollinated. It doesn't use bees or wasps or flies, moths, butterflies as pollinators. It relies on wind and random chance. So one way to sort of give you an analogy for this is that pollination in ragweed is kind of like playing Powerball. Each individual pollen grain has a very, very low chance of actually making it to one of those white stigmas, fertilizing it to produce a ragweed seed. So if you're not going to have a very high success rate, it's sort of like if you buy one Powerball ticket, you're probably not going to win. I mean, the chances are very small. But if you were to buy thousands and thousands and thousands, you might have a better chance of winning because you get thousands and thousands of chances. So that's what ragweed does. It produces hundreds of thousands of these pollen grains, each with a very small chance of actually fertilizing an egg, but they make hundreds of thousands of them, and they blow up into the air very easily, spread around, and that's how they ensure that they get their seeds put into the next generation. Unlike goldenrod, which produces far less pollen, but it's got a delivery service. That goldenrod sticks on to butterflies and moths, bees and wasps and flies and beetles, and they go off to get nectar at another flower, delivering that pollen to the stigma of another plant, cross-pollinating those goldenrods. So that's the ultimate reason there for why ragweed produces so much pollen and goldenrod doesn't. The same thing would apply to pine trees, with why you get that yellow chalk dust like pollen in the roadside gutters in, say, early April or so. Pine trees are also wind pollinated, don't have pollinators that visit them. Oak trees, same thing. So lots and lots of pollen at that time of year, as you may have learned, like I did, where I accidentally left the windows open in my house on one of those days where the pine trees decided to drop their pollen, and then everything is covered in this chalk dust of pine pollen that is very hard to clean up and get rid of easily. So that's goldenrod. Boneset's out there giving us some nice colors right now. Something that we're just starting to see give us some color as we transition into autumn here are the leaves. Now, some plants, some of our native plants, have already had their leaves change color, and they've already dropped their leaves. Something like the painted buckeye here, it's already dropped its leaves. If you were to look at it in July, even early July, the leaves are starting to change color, and they'll get this yellow color and then drop. Buckeyes in general tend to change color early, drop their leaves early. This one, the painted buckeye, is a very good example of that, as a low, more of a shrub growing in bottomlands across the Piedmont of the Carolinas and Georgia. It's got a pretty small distribution just within the Piedmont. A little bit later on here, we're going to start to see black gum change in color. Some of them are already starting to turn color, get these nice red colors to the leaves there for black gum. And then we've also got, of course, one of our favorites, right? Poison ivy, starting to change color, some of it turning yellow, some of it turning red. It does get pretty colors in the fall. It's just ones you want to admire from a distance. But they do look a little pretty, I guess, for a plant that you probably don't want to get too close to. A nice little yellow warning sign of stay away for this time of year. But they're starting to turn. I've been seeing that happen for a couple of weeks now, and that'll continue through this month before they start to drop their leaves. Flowering dogwood is another one that starts to change pretty early. Late September into October, a lot of those flowering dogwood leaves are getting burgundy in color, also showing us those nice red fruits that are very good as a food source for migratory birds in autumn. Red maples change color early as well. So here is one example where they start to change in September and then into October. But red maple can have many different colors that they will get. Part of it depending on a cultivar that you might have. Some of them get a particular bright red or a burgundy as they're selected with particular cultivars. But even within more natural ones, they can be many different colors, as I've got shown right here. So these are all red maple leaves that I collected, and everything from ones that are still green to ones that are kind of yellowish, getting a bit more into the orange hues, and then some reddish hues, all the way back to where they were during the summer again there with green. So quite a few different colors. So we're going to talk about what gives us those different colors, why they produce those different colors. Are they always there, or are they coming in new in autumn? That's what we're going to talk about here with these tree leaves in just a second. So another species you'll start to see changing here pretty soon, getting into mid-October, late October, depending on how far north you are towards the mountains or more down towards the coastal plain. Sassafras. It can have leaves that turn yellow, like this one right here. Now this one is kind of an interesting one because it's also got these little sort of, like somebody took a paper punch to the leaves. You might have seen this on sassafras leaves, or it's also very common on eastern redbud leaves. Those are indicators of the leafcutter bee. And so what happens here is female leafcutter bees go off to the leaves of sassafras and eastern redbuds, and they cut out these circular parts of the leaves, take it back to their underground burrow, lay an egg with some food, and then seal off the cell underground with that food and the egg, and then up grows the next generation from that cell of the next leafcutter moth or leafcutter bee generation. And they'll just make this sort of train-like series of one after another cells with an egg and some food, and they're separated by these little round cutouts of leaf section. So you may have seen those and thought one of the neighbor kids was coming around with the paper punch or something like that, going after your leaves, but it's not the neighbor kids, it's leafcutter bees, one of our native groups of bees that do that pretty often. Sassafras can also turn red. So variation within the leaf colors based on what pigments you are seeing within those particular leaves. So hickory is another one that will be turning here in late October. Unlike red maples, which can have lots of different colors that they might turn, or sassafras that can be quite variable, hickories turn yellow. So some people have referred to it as the hickory gold in the autumn, where they get this nice yellow color like this mockernut hickory right here. So we're going to go through this as an example of a sweet gum leaf. Another one of our native trees here, one that some people are not crazy about given the gum balls that it produces, but they are a great source for caterpillar food. and also give you some really pretty leaves. You can get leaves from the greens of summer and some lighter greens in autumn, and then yellows and oranges and darker oranges and reds and into sort of a burgundy or purple color, all within the same species of tree, varying within one branch to another, one tree to another. And what gives us that variation is the different types of pigments. So if we look at these different pigment types, what gives us the green in the summertime is the chlorophyll pigment, of which there's different types of chlorophylls, but they give us green colors to the leaves. If you start to get leaves that are yellow, that's a different type of pigment called the xanthophylls, versus those that are orange, which are carotenoid pigments. You may be familiar with that from a carrot, which has beta carotene pigments that give carrots their particular orange color. We've got the same sort of thing here with carotenoid pigments in leaves of trees, giving us orange colors within the leaves, just like a carrot looks orange. And then you've also got pigments that give you reds and into burgundies and purples, and those are the anthocyanins that you see down here. These different type of pigments giving us different sort of functions that they do within the tree. So let's go into what some of those different functions are and what they do for the tree. But before we do that, we're going to go into why you see the colors in the first place. So why am I seeing from one pigment a green color versus a different pigment like a xanthophyll, I see yellow, or a carotenoid, I see an orange? What causes that? Well, it has to do with the electromagnetic spectrum and what parts from the solar system and from the sun ultimately make it down here to Earth and contact those leaves. So we've got this spectrum here of electromagnetic energy here that we get from the sun and from space. And some of these parts are things that don't penetrate our atmosphere, don't interact with us really, because we don't see it, unless maybe you're Superman and you can see in infrared. We don't see in infrared. A rattlesnake senses and can sense their environment in infrared, but we don't see with infrared vision like Superman. We don't have ultraviolet vision as humans either, but lots of life does. Birds see into the ultraviolet range. Many insects see into the ultraviolet range. Some mammals do as well, just not us as humans too much. There's some people can see into it just a little bit, but not really a specialty of ours. Other wavelengths here within the electromagnetic spectrum that we interact with, X-rays. We don't see X-rays. We don't have X-ray vision unless you're Superman once again. But it's another part of that electromagnetic spectrum. But really the only part that interacts with us as we see it, and what gives us the color of leaves, is this little part right here called the visible light spectrum. The part that gives us that rainbow of colors, that Roy G. Biv, from red, orange, yellow, green to blue, indigo, and violet of the rainbow, called the visible light spectrum because it's visible to our eyes, hence the visible light spectrum that will penetrate through our atmosphere, contact those leaves, and let us see the world around us. So what we see as the rainbow of colors, the color spectrum, are those aspects of the visible light spectrum right here, from the violets to the greens to the reds. We see the part that is reflected off of an object back to go through our pupils and be detected by the cones in our retina. So we see what is reflected off of the leaf, as you see right here. On this particular leaf, what we see with our eye right here would not be any of the violet colors because they are absorbed by pigments within the leaf, not reflected off to contact the cones in our eye. We don't see the blues, we don't see the yellows or the oranges or the red because they are absorbed and used by that plant for some sort of photosynthetic process, possibly. So we see what is reflected off of the leaf and not absorbed and used by pigments within the leaf. We see what is not used by that tree for photosynthesis, the part that's reflected. And the most common pigment in many plant leaves is chlorophyll. And guess what part of the spectrum it reflects? Green. So most plant leaves look green because that's what they're reflecting. They're not absorbing it and using that to do photosynthesis. It gets reflected off, and that's what we see as green with the cones in our eye. So these different pigments within the leaf, be it various types of chlorophyll or carotenoid pigments, some of them, as you can see here, with their light absorption on the y-axis here, they have a high absorption of parts of the visible spectrum in that particular color. So carotenoids and the chlorophylls absorb, meaning they use to do photosynthesis, wavelengths of light in that visible spectrum within the violets, in the indigos, and the blues. And they don't use the green region in the middle. But then once again, some of them, like the chlorophylls, use a lot of that orange and yellow and red end of the spectrum to do their photosynthesis. So they absorb it and use it, and it doesn't get reflected back to go into the cones of our eyes and be detected as color, because we see what is not used, what gets reflected, not absorbed and used for photosynthesis. So throughout the course of a sweet gum leaves lifespan during the spring and summer into early fall, we'll just kind of walk through the different pigments and what they do here. Within leaves, throughout much of the year, they have some of those orange pigments, the carotenoids, but they're sort of a minor pigment. So as we saw right back here, carotenoids are present when you've got those chlorophylls. They're just not terribly abundant, but they are there absorbing these wavelengths of light right here in the blue range that the chlorophyll isn't absorbing very much of. So what these carotenoid pigments do as an advantage for the plant is it gives it a part of the spectrum to absorb beyond what the chlorophyll would do. So more light absorption across a broader range of the spectrum, that's more to work with as visible light energy to power your photosynthesis and make sugars as a plant doing photosynthesis. So that's the advantage that these carotenoid pigments can provide for that sweet gum leaf, is give it some extra absorption of energy from the sunlight. It's also got xanthophylls in there as well that give us some yellow. Those help with sort of a UV and visible light sunscreening effect to protect that leaf from damage from the light. So it's sort of a low abundance sunscreen within that leaf, protecting it from the electromagnetic spectrum parts that can do some damage to that leaf tissue. It's also got tannins in there. This varies from one type of tree to another. For instance, you may know that oaks have a lot of tannins in their leaves. That's why they'll turn brown in autumn, is what's left after the chlorophylls go away is all of that brown tannin. And that gives them the brown color of oak leaves. That particular pigment isn't something that is used to absorb energy for photosynthesis. Rather, it's this breakdown end product, sort of a waste product that is used as an anti-herbivory chemical in the leaf to be distasteful and deter things from eating the leaves. So it's a way for that tree leaf to defend itself from things eating those leaves, an anti-herbivory chemical within the leaf. Now, of course, the big one, which is very abundant, are the chlorophylls, much more abundant than the carotenoids and the xanthophylls, and in the case of the sweet gum, the tannins as well. And so during most of the year, that sweet gum leaf looks green because it is chock-a-block full of chlorophyll. And you don't even see the carotenoids or the xanthophylls that are there, but they're just masked by this overabundance of chlorophyll relative to those carotenoids that are absorbing some other wavelengths of light in that blue range that the chlorophyll isn't, and it all just looks green. But coming up this time of year in October, mid-October, late October, the chlorophyll starts to break down, and we recycle that and use that chlorophyll energy within it to be taken back up into the plant and conserve that energy and not just have it drop down with the leaves. So the chlorophyll is degraded. That starts to go away. And what do you see now? The pigments that were always there, but masked. So now in the fall, you see the xanthophylls that were always there, the carotenoids that were always there, but in low amounts, masked by the chlorophyll. With the chlorophyll gone, now you see them. So that's the oranges and the yellows and the browns from tannins, the greens of the chlorophylls. But what about the purples and the burgundies? That's a different story. With that, that comes with anthocyanins. And this is a pigment that wasn't there in the spring and the summer. Rather, this is a new one that starts to get produced in the autumn when the leaves are losing the chlorophyll. So this is what gives us the reddish colors, the purple colors, the burgundy colors, as this anthocyanin that may have some sort of a UV protection, sunscreening effect. There is some suggestion that maybe it has some anti-herbivory properties as well, but it's a new pigment being produced at that particular time of year. So that's how you're getting these reds here, or the purples in a sweet gum or in a maple tree with their characteristic red of the maple tree. It's those new anthocyanin pigments. A great way to see that is to look at something like sourwood. So during most of the year, sourwood has these nice green leaves with lots of chlorophyll doing photosynthesis with those pigments, but we're seeing what's reflected off as all of this overabundance of chlorophyll. And so we're seeing what's reflected here, but when they break down that chlorophyll in autumn, the green goes away, and sourwood starts to produce lots of these red colors, purple colors, as those leaves are exposed to sunlight. Those are the anthocyanins, and where you get lots of them tend to be on leaves getting lots of direct sun exposure, as we can see right here. So what I'm going to do is show you this video where I pull away some of these leaves layer by layer, and you'll see how their color changes based on whether they were exposed to sun and producing anthocyanins as a UV sunscreen to protect those leaves. There's the green, was hidden in the shade. There's another one. And so where it's nice red from those anthocyanins is where it's exposed to sun, and you're producing those sunscreen anthocyanin pigments there. pretty common to find if you just fold back some leaves and look at what parts are getting lots of sun, which parts aren't getting quite as much of the sunlight exposure. So those are anthocyanins, new pigment in the autumn. All right, so that's leaf color change and what causes them. Now, I'm sure that many of you are very well familiar with the Joro spider out there in Atlanta. You're sort of in that area where it first got introduced and where it started to spread. But let's imagine you're looking at some of these sourwood leaves or some of these sweet gum leaves, and you see a spider there in the tree. There's a lot of people that struggle with telling the Joro spider from some of our other native orb weavers, and they might think that they have a Joro spider and want to kill it or something like that, but it's actually not a Joro spider. So how do we tell these spiders apart? And what are the different spiders that it could be? One of them you might have is this one right here, the golden silk orb weaver, or what's called the banana spider, given this sort of banana-like shape to the abdomen of the females. And that's the banana spider, which you can identify from this tan-colored abdomen right here. It's also a very large spider with these tufts on their legs. So right here is one of those black tufts. You've got another one up here. You can see them a little bit better on these legs here with these swellings. And that tells you that's a banana spider, a golden silk orb weaver. None of our other spiders have that appearance. For those of you in Atlanta, you probably don't see this spider too often. It's more common further south into the coastal plain, but you might occasionally see one that got brought up on some horticultural plants and things like that. They are a rather large spider, 1.5 to 2 inches long for the females, so larger than the other spiders we're going to see right here. One you're probably very well familiar with, and a little bit smaller, is the yellow garden spider, or what you may have learned as the writing spider. So they don't have the big tufts on the legs, but they do have these characteristic sort of pinkish parts of their legs close to the body. They've also got legs that typically get held in an X-like shape when they're hanging there in the web. And they're a little bit smaller, about 1 inch or so long in the body, right through there. So that's the yellow garden spider, or what we call the writing spider, because it looks like they write on their web. They're the ones that have that very distinct zigzagging white that goes back and forth on the web, giving it the name writing spider, because it looks like somebody wrote across that web right there. So the old wives' tale or folk tale of the South and other parts of the country was that if you found your name written by the writing spider in that web, then that's not a good sign. You're probably not going to live much longer if you see your name written in the web. But fortunately, they tend to just go back and forth, zigzag, zigzag, zigzag. So unless your name is like I think you're pretty good. You don't have too much to worry about. But that's the origin of that writing spider name there for the yellow garden spider. Another one we've got is the banded garden spider right here, named after these bands of black and yellow that goes across sort of an off-white, creamy abdomen. And also one of our native orb weavers that you'll find in similar habitats around yards with the yellow garden spider, and about the same size, a 1 inch long body here from the head to the end of the abdomen right there. But one of our native spiders. The one that's introduced recently over the past 10 years or so is the Joro spider. So this was introduced from Asia, East Asia, Japan probably. And what you can use to identify it as one of the features here is this sort of yellowish abdomen with these silvery, bluish gray bands across the top of that abdomen. That's the Joro spider and one of its characteristic features. Another feature that you're may well be familiar with is that if you look at that web in just the right light, it sort of has a yellowish goldish color to it. It's also uh, not as much of a sheet web in sort of a linear plane. It's more of this three-dimensional messy structure, oftentimes a bit higher up than what you'd have for a yellow garden spider or a banded garden spider. And that web is also very strong, at least in my experience with the ones I have touched. If I pull on a yellow garden spider silk line or a banded garden spider silk line, it'll stretch and bend. But on that Joro spider web, it's really strong relative to the other spiders, at least in my experience of playing with their webs and seeing what they feel like. It's a rather strong silk. They're also roughly that same size of about an inch. So you could confuse them size-wise with our native garden spiders, but once again, smaller than that banana spider, more common to the coastal plain. Now you may be wondering, is the Joro spider an invasive species? Is it something that we should be concerned about? Does it have any detrimental effects on our native spiders? This is something that we have to get more research on, but what has been studied and found thus far, it's limited in scope, but it appears that in areas where you have lots of Joro spiders, you don't get as many of the native spiders like the banded garden spider and the yellow garden spider if there's Joros present. So that would suggest that it may be taking away habitat from our native orb weavers. Hopefully it turns out that that's not the case, or at least not the case long term. But that is my concern and the concern of many people, that it may take away habitat and we'll have less of the native spiders that we're used to from our childhood out there in the garden. Okay, so as you look off across into the woods here in the autumn, after the leaves have changed colors and after many of the leaves have dropped, you might see some that still have leaves on the tree. They might have a brown color like this American beech tree right here with this sort of light tan or straw colored set of leaves. You might see the same thing going on with oaks, which keep their leaves and keep them as this brown, tannin-rich leaf through the winter. The one I'm showing you right here for the beech is one that's very easy to see in the winter because those light leaves really kind of pop in the sunlight when everything else has lost its leaves. And those small beech trees in particular, the young ones, keep those leaves and really just pop out there in the understory of the forest because they kept their leaves. And that light straw color really sticks out when the sunlight hits it. The beech tree, as many of you are probably familiar, is the tree that has the smooth gray bark that people unfortunately carve into for the bigger trees. Obviously, not something that you should do, but that's the tree we're talking about here, the American beech and the retention of its leaves. Now, this process of keeping the leaves, not losing them like a sweet gum would do or a hickory would do. This process is what we call marcescence. It's a pretty interesting little term, maybe one you'd want to throw out in Scrabble if you get the right combination of letters. It has a pretty respectable word score, I would say. If you get the right letters to spell it, why not try to get marcescence in there on your Scrabble? That's what we call the retention of leaves. That's what the American beech tree does. That's what oak trees do. That's what some of the hornbeams do, keeping their leaves through the winter and then dropping them off in the springtime. Marcescence. Now, why would they do that? Why not just drop your leaves like any other tree? Well, there's some various hypotheses, some of which have some experimental evidence to support them. One of which is something you can see right here from this American beech. Notice on this tree, it's got the bud for next year's leaf right up here. So there's a leaf bud sticking off the end right there. They're very sharp. and it's down, or it's up above, I should say, these leaves held on the tree right here. So one hypothesis for why beech trees keep their leaves is that these leaves are pretty distasteful to deer and other herbivores that may be able to reach them. So if they're trying to get to that tasty leaf bud, it's hard to get to it because you've got all of these distasteful leaves surrounding it. So it's just not easy to get to them compared to another tree like a pawpaw or something else that has buds that are not protected by leaves. So they go and eat some other leaf, not the beech tree. That's one hypothesis. Another is that the retention of those leaves may deter browsers in another way by just kind of getting in the way. If you imagine yourself as a deer trying to reach up into those branches and get those leaf buds and the twig buds, and there's these leaves hanging down in the way, it's hard to get to those buds if you don't have like an arm you can stick up there with an opposable thumb and grab that twig and keep it in place. Every time you stick your head up there, your nose bumps that branch away, and you can't quite get to that bud very easily if there's leaves surrounding it. So it's sort of like bobbing for apples, where you're trying to get that apple and it keeps bouncing away as you try to grab it in the water there. Deer trying to get to those buds have the branch bounce away as they get those leaves bumping into their nose. So there is some experimental evidence suggesting that that marcescence of the beech makes it inefficient for the deer and other browsers, maybe an elk, to go after those buds and forage on those buds that the tree wants to use to grow new branches, grow new leaves next year. They protect them with that marcescence. So something else we've got going on right now, and you're probably aware of this, some of you may have even seen some of these maps on social media, and that is the migration of birds back down to the neotropics for the winter. So for this evening, perhaps, or actually, we're going to have predicted 364 million birds heading south tonight, many of them heading after midnight or so until early in the morning, heading down to Central America, South America to spend the winter before they come back to breed next year. One of the things that you can do to help them make it down to South America and Central America safely is to give them food. As you might imagine, making that flight is a pretty energy intensive thing, and they've got to stop as a bird at their version of a gas station to rest and fuel up again. And when they want to fuel up, they're going typically after fruits. It's not seeds, it's fruits and insects primarily. Really, a lot of the fruits on these fall producing native plants. So things like pokeweed or sassafras, American beautyberry, flowering dogwood, all of these native plants that give us fruits in late summer and retain them through autumn and into the winter. That's a primary food source for these birds to power their migration down south. So you're probably familiar with many of these. This pokeweed here that gets the really dark purple flowers that you may be familiar with collecting the leaves of in spring for poke salad. Of course, sassafras that you may be familiar with from making sassafras tea, or sassafras is the original source of the flavoring of root beer when Hires made the first root beer using, as the sign would say right here, made with the roots, barks, and herbs, giving it that root beer taste. What they took from the sassafras was the bark and outer covering off of the roots, turned it into this powder that they would use along with other materials to make their root beer back 100 years ago or so as the Hires Root Beer Company. So that's one of the original sources of using sassafras here in the United States for root beer. Um, so what we can do with these plants is give our birds lots of food to migrate. And this is a better food source than many of the non-native plants they might go after for food, because with our native plants, they tend to have a higher fat content. Whereas non-native plants that you might have in your landscape from Asia that are also fruiting tend to have a higher sugar content. Now you might be thinking, sugar, fat, what's the difference? Who cares? Well, it makes a big difference to the birds in migration because of the caloric density. Fats have almost twice as much energy as sugars do. So for the same volume of food consumption, you can get nearly twice as much energy, twice as many calories by eating fat-dense fruits that are native versus those of non-native plants that are much less fatty, more sugar-rich, that have half the calories. And you're looking for calories because you got to fly down to Central America or South America. You're looking to put on those calories to power your flight across the Gulf of Mexico or whatever you might be looking to do as a migratory bird this time of year. So that's the value of those plants, particularly at this time of year with the fruits. Now, somebody else that's looking to not necessarily migrate, but they are looking to move around a bit right now are turtles. So your snapping turtle, your box turtle, your painting turtle, your river cooter, whatever sort of turtle you might have seen during the warmer times of year, you don't see them very much in the winter. So what do they do in autumn? Where do they go? It depends on the species, but this time of year, you'll see these turtles kind of walking around, taking off, like you might see this snapping turtle going down the road, like a buddy of mine got a video of right here. So this is a turtle from early autumn. So there he goes. So what this turtle here is looking to do is to find its place to overwinter. They've been out feeding and reproducing during the summertime and the spring, and now it's time to overwinter. So what turtles do is they will overwinter doing this process of what's called brumation. So unlike what you might have been thinking, well, that turtle's not going off to find the nearest pizza joint. I mean, I guess some turtles do that, but not the snapping turtle we saw there. He's looking to go brumate. So what in the world is brumate? That's basically the ectotherm or cold-blooded animal version of hibernation. So warm-blooded animals, endotherms like a bird or a bat or any mammal, they do what we call hibernation. And the equivalent of that for a cold-blooded animal, an ectotherm like a turtle, is what we call to brumate, not hibernate, it's brumate. So what they will do is go burrow into the leaf litter. That's what a box turtle oftentimes does. Or they might go into a creek or a pond or a lake or mud, a burrow, soil, and burrow into that substrate. And then as they do that, they lower their metabolism and their heart rate drops and they use very little energy and live off of that storage energy reserve that they've gotten from the summertime and just chill and wait for the next spring to happen. So that's their brumation process. And then they'll pop back out in the spring, maybe with some dirt stuck on your back like this snapping turtle right here. This is a a somewhat famous photo that went viral, taken by a buddy of mine, Tim Roth. Uh, this is one he was radio tracking, and it wasn't actually brumating here. It had just burrowed down in the mud to sort of take a siesta for a while, and then it popped back out of the mud, and all the mud was stuck on its back there. But if it were to brumate in the mud or to brumate in the bottom of a pond, it'd be down there in the mud, just like this, lowering that metabolism, not using a lot of energy, waiting for the warm weather to come back, and then it goes out, eats, becomes more active, and starts to reproduce again the next year. So that's what turtles are doing this time of year. Now, something else you might be hearing are lots of bird calls. So I'll show you what this one is like. This is one you're probably pretty familiar with, the blue jay call. So these are very common right now. Anytime you go outside, you're probably hearing blue jays in your yard, in your garden, and they make a lot of different sounds. So I'll play a few of them here for you to listen to. So that's the blue jay doing that jeer, jeer song and all of these other calls that they make as a blue jay. So they make many different sounds as they try to let others know about their presence. So you may have noticed with these blue jays that this time of year they're starting to get very loud and vocal, but they weren't doing that during the summertime. They weren't doing that so much during the springtime. So what changed? Why so loud now? Why are they so loud in the fall and the winter relative to the spring and summertime? A big part of that answer probably has to do with their nesting season being done. They've already had their young, and so now they can be noisy and do what jays like to do and make lots of noise and chatter at each other. Whereas before, if they did that when they're nesting, you're going to attract predators to your nest, and that may cause a hawk or some other predator to eat your young. So now they can be noisy, whereas they had to be quiet before. They also have a lot of hawks migrating through to go south for the winter right now. When jays see hawks or other predators, they oftentimes make a lot of chattery noises at it and communicate about the presence of this predator. So that's also why they're perhaps making some of that noise this time of year in particular. Jays just in general are kind of chatty and noisy for most of the year, except for when they're nesting, and then they're quiet to keep the young safe. So we're back to being noisy jays once again this time of year. Something else you're going to be doing here probably pretty soon, some of you may have even started, is to do something about those leaves falling off the trees onto your lawn or wherever you may want to not have leaves be present. Now, what a lot of people might do is say, well, I want to do something eco-friendly. I'm going to just mulch up my leaves and I'll use those as some garden compost or something like that, which it's better than burning them or throwing them in the dump. But something you want to consider with doing that is that what's in the leaves. There may be some things in there that you're not thinking about. For instance, if we look at these leaves right here, do you notice anything special about those leaves? Is it just leaves or is there something else there? You look carefully, you might see this structure right there dangling off the base of that oak leaf right there. And that is the cocoon of a polyphemus moth, where it had its pupal case inside of that cocoon. So if that's attached on to that leaf stalk and that leaf drops, inside of that cocoon could be next year's generation of that polyphemus moth. And if you chop it up with your mulcher, or burn it or whatever, there goes the next generation for that particular moth individual. So that's the downside, is you're not going to get as many of those beautiful polyphemus moths if you don't retain the leaves. So what I encourage people to do as best you can is to put those leaves maybe into a natural or wild space in your yard, into a planting bed, and use it as some mulch for your planting bed as those leaves decompose. That'll let that polyphemus moth develop and come out next year as a moth. And it also gives us lots of habitat for all sorts of invertebrates and other wildlife that would live down in that leaf litter during the wintertime, protected from the cold, having some moist substrate near the ground to protect them from dryness and the elements, giving us habitat for things like fireflies. Fireflies spend much of their life looking like this right here, not like the firefly that we think of. Their larvae live down in that leaf litter, feeding on worms and millipedes and other sorts of invertebrates down there in that leaf litter. But they've got to have the leaf litter as habitat to attract their prey, to give them protection from drying out, to give them protection from getting too cold in the winter time. And your leaf litter can provide that as well. Now, one of the questions I had last time was whether these lightning bugs or fireflies need to have pine trees. And that was something that I hadn't heard of before. Although when I did some Googling around, I did see some websites that said that fireflies need pine trees. However, none of them that I found at least give a citation of where they got that information. And that's new knowledge to me, because I have I've never heard that they need pine trees. And so what I did is I looked up in this book right here, Fireflies, Glowworms, and Lightning Bugs, Identification and Natural History. And this firefly researcher who wrote the book did not mention that fireflies need pine trees, although they could use it as a substrate to lay their eggs. That's not what they need. They just need some sort of a leaf litter or ground substrate to lay their eggs into. It could be crevices within rocks or around the roots of trees. That's going to give them habitat to lay their eggs, and with that substrate, a place for their larvae to develop. So they don't need pine trees in particular, although pine needles could provide them with habitat to lay eggs and have their next generation, but it's not required. So that's my talk here for autumn. I do have the fall talk coming up here in the future, so winter is coming, as they say. If you have topics of interest, let me know. Something I'll probably talk about are plants that we think about in the wintertime, things like mistletoe, where you'll see these white sticky berries of mistletoe on the plants around Christmas time. So we'll talk about why those berries are sticky, what mistletoe is as a plant, how does it make its living as what's called a hemiparasite, and how that differs from just a regular parasite, and how they make their life as a mistletoe. So if you're interested in that or learning more, you can follow me on social media, Facebook or Instagram, where I write about things like this every day, talking about what you can find this time of year out there in nature, off in the woods, or even just in your own backyard if you're willing to look and listen for what's out there around your home. So with that, I'll open it up for questions, and I'd be happy to answer anything you might have.
All right, thanks, Sean. That's great. We don't have any questions in the queue right now, but I have one.
Sure.
One myself. And in case everybody on here doesn't see your stuff on Facebook, with the hurricane coming tonight and the hurricane that we just had a few weeks ago, you had a fascinating post on what do the birds and the butterflies do when they're flying south during a storm. So can you talk about that for a minute?
Yeah. So I was writing about the cloudless sulfur butterfly, which you see a lot of them this time of year. The cloudless sulfur is a yellow butterfly, very bright yellow, sulfurous in color. maybe a 1.5 inch wingspan or so, 2 inch wingspan or so to them. And they're generally flying about 6 to 10 feet up and going pretty directly fast straight south. They're looking to go down to the Gulf Coast and overwinter. But when a low pressure is coming in, a storm system is coming in, what they do is they kind of do what we would do, and they hunker down in leaf litter, in bushes, places that are low, protected from the wind, protected from the rain, and just wait it out. They can't fly in strong winds. They don't want to get all wet and knock scales off. They try to protect themselves and get to cover when a storm system is coming in. And then when it passes through, get back to flying. Many birds will do similar sorts of behaviors. So what we know many birds can do, and probably all birds can do, is they have a sense of being able to detect the air pressure, so the barometric pressure. So when a storm system is coming in and a low pressure is coming in, they can detect that. And what they will oftentimes do is go out and forage, get lots of feeding done before that storm system comes in, likely from this awareness that once the storm comes, I'm not going to be able to go out and feed. So let's get to feeding before that storm system comes. There is some suggestion that certain birds like veeries can predict hurricanes coming, that sort of thing. Still a lot of research that needs to be done on that, but birds can certainly, at least some of them, and probably many or most, can detect pressure changes and know that storms are coming from that barometric pressure.
Good. So we did have one question pop up in the chat, and it's, do birds eat the Juro spider?
That's a good question. I have not seen anybody saying that. They are a pretty big spider. The challenge for birds is if you go after a Juro spider, they're kind of on the inside of that pretty three-dimensional web. It'd be hard to get to them and not get yourself tangled up or injure yourself with the branches in that web. So I wouldn't say that they couldn't do it. You know, a blue jay could eat a Juro spider if you could get to it. But for many of them deep in that web, it's probably kind of challenging to get to the Juro spider. But the males, they're much smaller, might be a much easier one to get to. But I don't know if we really know a whole lot about that yet with what might go after them a lot. But hopefully the birds do. I have not seen a predation event on one of them, but it'd be great if the birds do go after them. But we'll see, I guess, with more observations and more study.
Yep. So we got one more question, and this will be the last one. So how does wildlife use wild flower heads that are past blooming?
Okay, so after they have bloomed, what's going to happen in that flower head is the pollen is going to pollinate the egg of that flower head and lead to producing a fruit or a seed. So what that provides for that bird, let's say, is a fruit to eat or a seed to eat during the winter time. So even things like the common ragweed that we don't like due to ragweed hay fever and stuff, it's a pretty decent food source for birds in winter with all of those seeds that it produces. Sparrows and other birds can go after those ragweed seeds as a food source that's available to them during the winter time. So that's what they're going to produce, and that's just part of the circle of life, the food web, giving food for other wildlife as you try to reproduce yourself, and some of it gets eaten by birds and other wildlife.
All right, well, great. Well, this has been a fascinating webinar for sure. We thank you again for your time, and thank you all for joining us. So again, the next series is going to be the winter session, and that will be January 8th. So we're going to call it Preparing for the Resurrection, talking a little bit, like he had said, the mistletoe, things you might see, but also things that when we talk about preparing, how do invasive plants actually kind of interrupt that natural cycle? So that's my big beef with English ivy. It prevents the sun from hitting the ground. So we'll talk some about that too. And then the last thing, again, go to gnps.org if you're not a member already and sign up. And you could also see on there the volunteer opportunity. So if you're in North Metro, we actually have a volunteer session this weekend at Rucker Farm up in Alpharetta. And we're going to be removing a lot of those invasive species. So if you want to help out, please do that. So with that, thanks again, and we will see you next time.
Great. Thank you very much. And if you have anybody has suggestions for topics, just contact me on Southern Piedmont Natural History. Send me a message, and I can put that into the talk.
All right.
Thank you, everybody.